I haven't read Montesquieu. I've read
Yeah.
some Locke, but I can't remember what he has to say on it.
Yeah.
Would you say that if I were to apply their notion of equality to, say, would they disagree with, say, a native population having more rights than a
Not at
foreign-born
all.
population?
Not at all. And
Okay.
Montesquieu, I think the US founding fathers thought he was the GOAT. And Montesquieu is extremely and explicitly stating that in order for any kind of republic to work, you need to have a sort of civic nationalist approach to it, and also you need to foster a love of country.
Mm-hmm.
So he would be entirely against, let's say, right now the Democrat pressured, the U.S. Democrats pressuring all kinds of narratives that create a kind of internal domestic guilt and self-hatred.
Mm-hmm.
And he would definitely say this, that, for instance, you have you don't give all sorts of rights to everyone. But what is interesting to bear in mind is that questions of multiculturalism didn't arise until fairly recently. So in their minds, in Locke's and let's say Montesquieu's mind, they didn't have that. They didn't have it in their mind what we experience nowadays. I don't know if they even thought that was possible, or even worth thinking of as a conjecture.
Mm-hmm.
I think they would be very much against it.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of add that caveat because there are people who use the term equality or its sort of opposite, inequality, to talk about global inequality and how people from other countries have a right to our country.
Yeah.
Is that a perversion of the term equality, or is that using it in a way in which it makes conceptual sense, but the actual argument is flawed? How do you kind of approach that?
I think it is a form of equality, but the question is who supports it. People like Montesquieu wouldn't support it. And to give a hint on why I think he would be entirely against no criteria multiculturalism is because his main book, Spirit of the Laws, his magnum opus, is essentially a book about legislation and how all sorts of different cultures require a different approach towards legislation. And he is talking very much about economic geography, very much about the customs and mores and religions of different societies. So he says you can't legislate for everyone. You can't legislate for every culture. So he would be, I think he would be very skeptical of zero breaks multiculturalism.
Okay, yeah, I wasn't trying to catch you out. It was just an important thing to my mind to kind of nail that down.
Yeah. Now, let's go to rights, because this is another word that some people hate the word rights right now, but I think it's more of a reaction.
Well, I'm of the
How can
opinion,
you hate rights and be libertarian?
because I think the term rights makes it out to mean that the state, the government is the provider of them. And the main use of the term rights, like human rights or things like that, like I have a right to healthcare is one that you see at the minute, or things like that. I'm just like, well, actually, if we're talking objectively, you don't have a right to anything. You get what you know, in this life, you get what you can. And, you know, maybe this is just me being bitter that I've had to fight my way to get everything I have. But I don't think that anyone has a right to anything, and that the worst thing you can do is appeal to the state to claim, like, oh, I've got a right to clean water. It's like, well, what about if you live in the middle of the Sahara? You know, the burden you're going to have to place on other people to get that water to you is unreasonable, right? You should just move. And I'm using that example as like a sort of thought experiment. Obviously, you know, it's not a problem that happens in most countries, but that example is important because people, you know, the claim, I have a right to clean drinking water, everyone will say, well, of course, you know, that's fundamental thing. It's one of the most important things to be a living human being. But then you look at the circumstances of it and look at what is actually entailed in fulfilling that right. And all of a sudden we have a very different situation. And if we're looking at applying sort of standards of fairness and other, political terms to it, then the concept of rights upsets lots of other political concepts that I think are more important. And I think although I sort of agree with the sort of underlying reason why people claim to have rights is basically that you're meant to have these certain things that needs to be met to live a fulfilling life. And I think that by trying to use the state to defend these, you're unwittingly giving them away, not preserving them. But I understand that my view of that is not typical of how the vast majority of people view what rights are. Normally rights are certain criteria in which the government either guarantees or should not infringe, depending on it, whether it's positive or negative liberty. And so it's quite often tied up in the notion of liberty.
I think I sense there is an overreaction there. Tell me if I'm eventually wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So the way I think of rights, the way I think it's important to think of rights is relative to recognition of power. So for instance, when we say some people have the right to do this or that, I think that we mean that they are in a society where they're recognized as having a particular kind of power which they can exercise. So I think that there is nothing problematic with that per se. What there is a significant problem with is what kind of things we think people should be allowed to pursue and should be recognized as having a power to pursue. And I think that that's the issue here. And in the same way, for instance, that I would say that the problem is not with virtue and appealing to ethics. The problem is with how people understand virtue, rightness, wrongness, goodness, and badness. I would say that the problem isn't so much with the idea of rights as much as with particular conceptions of what kind of things should be permitted or should be allowed.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about, for instance, property rights, we're saying that the stronger the property rights, the more the state recognizes your power to engage in economic activity and do with your property whatever you want. The more diminished the property rights, the more, let's say, conditions are placed upon them, the more we feel that the state is going to basically arbitrarily take from us what is a property.
So allow me to clarify some things. Like, my view of rights isn't, particularly strong. Like, I look at things like the Second Amendment. I think in our current political context, it's a brilliant thing, right? So it's not that I feel so strongly about rights that I can't recognize that in certain contexts they can be useful. I just think that as a concept, its justification can be quite weak. And I think it ultimately empowers the state to guarantee us things that we ourselves should guarantee. So, I would argue that we have property rights because I have the ability and the means to prevent people from taking my stuff.
Yeah, but if someone stole from you,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't you think that the role of the state is to address that?
Well, yes.
And you would say that you have paid your taxes and you want some security and the state should honor its part of the deal.
Yes, and I do believe in a justice system, even in my sort of ideal sort of scenario of what the state should look like. It's one of the few things I would keep.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think that you need to keep these things at the individual level as much as possible.
Yeah.
And sure, it's helpful to appeal to the state, but it should be sort of optional.
Yeah.
it should be, if I'm unable to guarantee my own rights, then it's for me to appeal to the state, ask the state, can you help me out here? Rather than the state is the only thing that guarantees your rights.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.